So thanks to the rehearse timings feature we learned about in the previous movie, we now have different timings set up for every one of the slides in our Leaf and Mortar presentation. You can open up Leaf and Mortar 0303 if you're skipping to this movie. On slide 1, for example, with the Transitions tab selected, we can see that the timing was set to 6 seconds on my presentation. But when we look at our slides, there are some that won't need timings, or will need the timings changed, or perhaps we'll simply use the timings that were set when we rehearsed them in the previous movie. So let's go from one slide to the next. Starting with slide 1, we realize this is one that's simply going to morph into slide 2. It doesn't need to show up there for 6 seconds, and it definitely doesn't need a mouse click. So we'll turn off the mouse click by deselecting the checkbox, and we'll bump this down. Now we can bump it down to a second. So after 1 second looking at this, it will morph into slide 2. Let's go to slide 2. That's what it'll look like. Okay, and this one has links, so we don't want to use any timings. We'll deselect the after checkbox. That ignores the timings that were assigned and instead requires a mouse click. Now we'll go on to slide 3, which will use those timings, and we don't want people clicking. So we'll deselect on mouse click. Same thing for slide 4, deselect on mouse click and use the timings. However, slide 5, the third slide in that section, as you can see down at the bottom, includes some buttons. So we do want mouse clicks, and we want to ignore the slide timings by deselecting after, and you can see my timings over here. They won't be used. A mouse click will be required. And because we see down below different buttons, they can go back to the beginning by choosing home, to the end with contact, or on to the next slide, which is slide 6. And in this case, it's one that will use the timings, not a mouse click. Deselect. We'll go through the next one and do the same thing. Slide 7 does not need a mouse click, but instead we'll use the timings. Scroll a little further down, and you can see on slide 8, it's the third one in the section with the buttons at the bottom. Also has the video, so in this case we want a mouse click and ignore the timings. Deselect after. I have 12.5 seconds showing up as my slide timing. Let's do the same now for the third section. Hardscaping is not going to use a mouse click. Scroll down to slide 10. It won't use a mouse click either. We want it to use the timings. And then slide 11, we want it to be a click that moves either back home or to the contact section, which is the next slide. Let's go to slide 12 over here on the left. We'll use the timings as opposed to mouse clicks. Same thing for slide 13. We'll let people look at it. I have just over 11 seconds. And instead of a mouse click, we want it to loop around back to the beginning. That's part of the kiosk style presentation we're going to be setting up. And to do that, we need to go to the slideshow tab. Click there and click Set Up Slideshow. It's from here where we choose Browsed at a Kiosk. You can see when each of these is selected, there are different checkboxes down below that will either be enabled or disabled by default. For example, if we go to Browse by an individual in a window, you can see I can't change a pen color. There is no pen color. If I go to Browsed at Kiosk, you can see it loops continuously until escape. So if you hide the keyboard, they all have to keep watching the presentation looping around and around. You can leave the mouse out for clicking those links, making it an interactive kiosk presentation. So all we need to do now is click OK to save that up, and we're ready to play our presentation in a kiosk style with interactions. Press F5 on your keyboard to start the presentation. Now you can see here with our presentation, it takes a second before we move on to the next slide. There's no slide timings. People need to click something. These are links. So if we want to go to landscape design, we click there and it takes us to that slide. This one should use timings. We read through this, gives us enough time to read the title, read the paragraph, even look at the image over on the right-hand side before it automatically moves on to the next slide. Here we see some images. Look at those, look at the title, read each of the bullets before it automatically moves on to the next slide. Again, using those timings that we set during the rehearse timings movie. Now on this one, we have buttons, so it's not automatically going to advance to the next slide. We can choose. If we want to go right to the end, we can click Contact. You can see our mouse pointer turns to a finger pointing when we're over the icon. Give it a click. It should take us to the Contact, Leaf and Mortar page. We will read this information. It's using the timings once again before moving on to the next slide, which is the last slide. When we see the last slide, we have an opportunity to read what's on the slide, look at the imagery, and eventually it should automatically loop around back to the beginning where we'll see that first slide morph into the second slide. Let's give it a second. There it goes, just like that. And what we have is a kiosk-style presentation with built-in interactivity. Press Escape when you're done, and there's your finished product.